We are inching ever closer to election night in November and wanted to give an update. Democrats are hoping to hold on to control of the Senate, obviously, and as the final primary elections of the 2022 season wrapped up yesterday, all eyes were on New Hampshire. The state held 3 different Republican primaries, including a closely watched Senate primary, where the winner will go up against Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan. And the results, Briahna?
Well, State Senate President Chuck Morse has conceded to retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Don Bolduc. Bolduc has 37% of the vote, while Morse has 36%, with 89% of the votes counted. That's according to AP and Decision Desk HQ. Bolduc has said he stands by signing a letter along with other military officials saying Donald Trump won the 2020 election, which Trump unequivocally did not, and also raised the possibility of abolishing the FBI.
In New Hampshire's first congressional district, Caroline Leavitt became the second Gen Zer to win their primary election. The former Trump White House aide beat Matt Mowers, who was backed by GOP House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Leavitt is another candidate who has embraced Trump's false claim that the election was rigged. So this is the same old story right now for the GOP, where they are having candidates win these primaries who are the most conservative or most, conservative doesn't even mean that anymore, the most Trump-loving, the most MAGA. Candidates who will not fare well enough in the general election. I mean, this is just the story this was the story in Arizona. It might be the story in Georgia. It could even be the story in Ohio, although I do think there J.D. Vance will pull it out. The Arizona candidate, Blake Masters, many of the Arizona candidates, their gubernatorial candidate, Kari Lake, these are all people who leaned hard into the Trump election claims, which is toxic for independent voters, Democrats who might be willing to vote for a GOP candidate because of the economy or school issues or something like that. Even many Republican voters just don't, they don't want to hear it from. These are not the issues that matter to them. Relitigating the 2020 election is not the issue. It's not something that matters to most Republican voters. That's not what they care about. We saw that in the Senate runoff elections in Georgia right after 2020, where the distraction provided by Donald Trump allowed the Democratic candidates to prevail. That's going to be the story again. I think it's very, very unlikely that Republicans take control of the Senate, and it's largely candidate-driven. There's other stuff in the mix too, but with different candidates, some of these races would have been winnable.
Does Biden have a point then when he gives a speech distinguishing MAGA Republicans from the rest of the party?
Certainly in terms of the candidates, absolutely. In terms of the candidates, there are pretty stark divisions in the Republican Party. A lot of these candidates hate Mitch McConnell, hate GOP leadership, et cetera. And court Trump's favor and want the support and the endorsement of the most vocally pro-Trump wing. But that's not everyone. That's a small, and actually Republicans have had this issue before. I don't know if this phenomenon is as prevalent on the Democratic side, but going back to election cycles in 2010, in 2012, you had cases of what seemed like winnable Senate races where a more fringe Republican candidate prevailed in a primary and then put that race out of contention. So this is a tale as old as time. Republican primary voters will just often back the most far right or most right-leaning person. And it's not, look, you got to be tactical, guys. Even if you want, you're really passionate about having that policy vision implemented. Many of these states are just not, this isn't Kansas. This isn't
I'm used to thinking of the Republicans as more strategic than the Democrats, but it looks like the tables are turning a little bit. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, top Democrats are confident the Dems will not only hold on to their thin majority, but also pick up additional seats. According to Punchbowl News, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi cited the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, along with a slew of legislative wins, as having swung the political edge in their favor.
Despite the Democratic leadership's positive outlook, the fact does remain that President Biden's approval numbers still dwell in the low 40s, and inflation, along with price increases, plague Americans' bank accounts. But let's take a step back altogether. So the New York Times' Nate Cohen is sounding the alarm when it comes to polling for this year's midterm. After the mishaps in 2016, 2020, Cohen writes, Democratic Senate candidates are outrunning expectations in the same places where the polls overestimated Mr. Biden in 2020 and Hillary Clinton in 2016. Right now, the 538 forecast has the Democrats favored to win the Senate, while Republicans are favored to win the House. Cohen explains that if the polls are just as wrong as they were in 2020, forecasting for both chambers would look much more competitive, writing the apparent Democratic edge in Senate races in Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Ohio would evaporate. To take the chamber, Republicans would need any two of Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, or Pennsylvania. With Democrats today well ahead in Pennsylvania and Arizona, the fight for control of the chamber would come down to very close races in Nevada and Georgia. And we were talking during the break about the Pennsylvania race, which is interesting because it did not at all seem, you would not think it was winnable for Republicans, given that they had nominated Dr. Oz, who frankly is not a candidate that excites really anyone in the Republican coalition. He is neither a sincere populist or Trump person. He has no sincerity about him, nor is he really pleasing to the Republican establishment or more Republican voters. He's just a guy. He's just a celebrity figure, absolute carpetbagger, makes no one happy. And John Fetterman, I saw early on the strength of his candidacy. He has a lot of sincerity to his populist vibes, his working class vibes.
Governor,
but he had this really crippling medical problem, and I am sorry, but if the clips of him giving even short speeches are rough. He is in bad shape. He cannot speak. It's bad.
Yeah.
It's real bad.
So I listened to, he did an extended interview on Pod Save America earlier this week that I listened to and was frankly kind of surprised by how, stuttering it was. Now, like it seemed like what you would expect of a lot of normal people who aren't especially articulate. I don't want to say that I would have heard the speech in a vacuum and said, oh, there's something cognitively impaired about that person or anything like that. And I'm not that familiar with how fluid his speech was before the show.
It was fine. We interviewed him on the show like a year ago when Ryan and I did it, I think, maybe Kim, and he sounded, it's night and day compared to how he sounds now.
It did sound rather halting, and it felt almost unfair or cruel in some ways for the Pod Save hosts who are obviously rooting for him to have him in that context. And maybe I'm reading into it, but it did feel like a bit of a tense conversation because I don't know if even they were prepared for how atypical he sounded in that context. At the same time, I think there are a lot of people in Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania who would happily vote for him completely bedridden and unable to do anything. You drew an analogy to Dianne Feinstein, who has been widely reported to be very much not with it for some time now. And I think a lot of folks would rather have a working class, local staff that is with them on the issues that are running a campaign or administration than having someone like Dr. Oz, who seems to not really have a clue at all.
If I were Fetterman's advisors, I would agree to zero debates. I would not have him make any more public maybe appearances and not say anything. There's no way it doesn't give some voters pause, which still might be, again, because Dr. Oz is such a bad candidate. The conditions were favorable for Democrats in Pennsylvania anyway. My guess is that he will limp over the finish line, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
Bad luck for Democrats, certainly.
Yeah. Well,
that happened.
The debate is happening, and we'll find out one way or the other what happens.
He did agree to one debate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was tactically